Good evening, everyone. So keep responding that you're alive or not. Okay. Good evening, everyone. So today I would be talking more on narratology. Narratology with reference to Samuel Chapman's analysis of the Dubliners, where he is using two texts for his analysis. But basically, I will give an introduction to this particular field called narratology. Narratology actually denotes both the ways as well as the theory for the study of narrative. By narrative, we understand the text, the image of the text, and the thought. So narratology denotes both the theory and the study of narrative. Narrative means the text, the image, and the thought. Narratology also denotes the narrative structure and the ways that these affect our perception of a literary text. So twofold analysis called narratology that talks about the theory and the study of narrative and narrative structure and the ways by which these affect our perception of a literary text. For a basic understanding of narratology, we have to know some basic concepts or terminology, as because it is also derived from Russian formalism, linguistic criticism combined together. So there is a scientific approach to the study in case of narratology. So I would be using certain critical terms related to narratology. Words like mythos. You're familiar with this word mythos?
No, sir. No, sir.
Remember 6 elements that Aristotle identified? So first was the mythos,
Or
the plot. Mythos, plot. Plot, character, thought, diction, melody, spectacle. Okay, mythos. So the first important word in narratology is mythos. Mythos referring to the plot. Diegesis. You again remember that Aristotle classified literary arts, poetic arts, poetry into 3 categories: the narrative, the lyrical, and the dramatic. So in the first category, narrative, longer narrative, he placed epic. In the second, lyrical, the short poems, the odes, and the third was the dramatic poetry. So narratology is more related to the telling of story, and this telling of story is called diegesis. Diegesis is more applicable to the text that tells you the story, while another word is mimesis or mimesis. So Plato Aristotle debate, you remember, on mimesis. Mimesis is a dramatic representation. Okay, copy of a copy of a copy, that is imitated. So it contains an element of narration, but that story is dramatized before the audience. In the field of diegesis, we have different types of narrators, and these words will come in our discussion: the homodiegetic narrator, the heterodiegetic narrator. In the field of narratology, we also have a word like focalization. Focalization, focus. How the narrative or the storytelling gives prominence to certain item through focus, through focalization. This term was introduced by Janet. Then I will be using words like overtness, covertness. So overt narration and covert narration. So overtness and covertness. And these two words were introduced in the field of narratology by Samuel Chapman. We also have words like voice, human limitations, omniscience, introduced by Lancer. We also have narrative situation, authorial, figural, reflector, introduced by Stanzel. And finally, we have a word like focalizer, introduced by Ball. So these are the key words in the field of narratology. Gerard Genett introduced 5 central categories of narrative analysis. So these categories are very important for our study of narratology. So these 5 central categories of narrative analysis are, according to Gerard Genett, number 1, duration, number 1, order, number 2, duration, number 3, frequency, then we have mood, and finally we have voice narrative discourse. So voice narrative discourse. Bakhtin, you remember Mikhail Bakhtin introduced the concept that language is thought, thought is language. So Bakhtin's concept that language is fundamentally dialogic. Language, any kind of discourse, any kind of speech act, according to Bakhtin, is dialogic. That means someone is speaking and someone is listening. So in case of monologic discourse, there is no addressee. But language, according to Bakhtin, is meant for communication. And for that communication, the addressor-addressee relationship, okay, one who is speaking and one who is listening, both these are important. Therefore, language, according to Bakhtin, is fundamentally dialogic. In the works of several writers, including James Joyce, on whom Seymour Chapman introduced his first seminal work in 1969, he published his essay. So Joyce frequently cultivates a dialogic style in his works, involving a conflict of voices as an integral part of the disruption and compilation of narrative, as well as for an ambivalent portrayal of character. Through this dialogic narrative mode, James Joyce is capable of producing a kind of ambivalent portrayal of character. And through James Joyce's Dubliners, the stories that we are familiar with, we will try to analyze narratology. Several types of wordplay can be seen in so many literary works. For example, Eliot's Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, where we have a dialogically agitated and tension-filled environment of words that are alien, okay, some kind of value judgments and accents. Just think of Eliot's work, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, where the voice of the female is heard, but in a very overt, in a very covert manner. In the room, women come and go talking of Michelangelo. And then we also have some voices of the female responding to the reminiscences, responding to the utterances, half utterances, mutterances of Prufrock that contains value judgments, certain types of accent. Most of the stories that we read, modern story is a modernist genre. So in most of the stories that we read, we find that these stories are repositories of living language and exhibit what Bakhtin has suggested, heteroglossia. Heteroglossia refers to internal stratification. Hetero means multiple, glosses that the narrative gives through this internal stratification of language. This also is an interplay among social, class, dialects, so many kinds of jargons, so many kinds of variations in language. Variations in language that refer to the dialectal variations, variations based on the field of discourse, mode of discourse, manner of discourse. Such registral variations are common in language, and language that serve the specific socio-political purpose of the time. Therefore, the art of reading any kind of narrative text, especially Joyce's short stories, depend on an imaginative and dramatic reconstruction of the missing links in the narrative that run through all the sections of narrative. especially the narrative structure, such as the setup, the conflict, the resolution. In his essay S/Z in 1970, Runa Barth suggested or stressed on the active role of the reader in constructing a narrative based on cues in the text. So narratology is also a study of finding out the cues in the text that are provided by the author. So through this critical reading of the theory called narratology, we will try to attempt a reconstruction of the underlying message that a writer usually offers through such narrative hints.
Sir, I didn't understand what is overtness and covertness.
The way I am speaking now is overt narrative. So I am trying to state things in a very clear and crystal clear manner. Okay, everything is contained in the text. But in case of poetry or in case of drama, we often find that such overtness is not there. Rather, it is replaced by indirectness, ironies, covertness. These are two forms of narration.
Okay,
so
sir,
the
okay.
language has internal stratification. There is an interplay. Social, class, dialect, jargons, register, variations, all these are there in language. And covertness and overtness also belong to this study of narratology. So we are going to study what is narratology. For this, we have to see how narratology has been used in text, and as the prose technicians often use language to represent things in overt or covert manner, make a kind of representation of reality in a language. So the fictional writer is actually communicating to you with the help of a text, and it appears, as in the stories of Ruskin Bond, we often find a kind of simple, candid, deceptively simple storytelling where things are told. And we have this kind of storytelling in the works of Joyce. But if we analyze the difference between the stories of Ruskin Bond and James Joyce, we find that while in Ruskin Bond, things are stated in a very simple way. In case of Proust, in case of James Joyce, the stories are stated not in such a simple way. So Dominic Head once, in his analysis of modern short story, in the book called Modernist Short Story, stated that the art of reading a short story is filling in the gap in between the narrative hints. So narratology will try to analyze how far the narrator, storyteller, that means the writer who is hiding behind the narrator, is able to represent the story and suggest narrative hints. Because of its brevity of form, usually a short story cannot say you everything, cannot narrate the story in completion that the novel can. Therefore, Dominic Head says that the art of reading a short story is like filling in the gaps in between the narrative hints. The study of narratology is not new. So we have this study of narratology even in the works of Plato. So in Plato's Ion, we have this discussion regarding the art of telling a story. In case of the Republic also, we have this analysis of storytelling. Although Plato regarded this storytelling as an act, diegetic act, that creates a kind of fictional world that is not the world that we can call real world, as it is removed from reality. And this removal from reality is because of its imitative nature. So we are telling a story, narrating a story with the help of language. And this language is a thing, a material meant for communication. And through this material communication, the story is not told as the story is, the ideal, the truthful, the absolute, the real story, that falters because of this imitative nature. Therefore, it is like other arts, a kind of copy. Diegesis is a kind of copy. Nevertheless, any kind of writer is a prose technician, a craftsman who is working with words, with language, and allowing the readers to have an understanding of multiple layers of meaning. We know that words in literature has fourfold meaning: the literal, the grammatical, the contextual, and finally the conceptual, that is related to the significance. So any reader can find multiple layers of meaning and significance in narratives. The interplay of story and text. Okay, the story and the text and the narration is a field of narratology. Okay, the study of the interplay of the story, the text, and the narration is the area of study called narratology. In James Joyce's Dubliners, we often find this, and using narratology for as a critical tool for analysis, like Seymour Chapman, I would like to say that in James Joyce's Dubliners, we have the story, we also have the text, we also have the narration. Take, for example, Araby, James Joyce's Araby. So it begins with the voice, North Richmond Road, begins with a narrative story that is not told. We are situated in the location, and from a focalized view, we are seeing the street. Soon we find the appearance of voices, the children's voices, and when they gather in the street, we have the appearance of the narrator. But then again, when the narrator appears in the story, the narrator uses, instead of the first person narrative, the pronoun we has been used. So that is the shift. Instead of I, the narrator is not speaking. Rather, we have a plural narrator, we, to introduce the story. But soon we find that another narrator is there, the boy narrator, who is talking or speaking in the story as I, as the first person narrator. So I will say that the interplay of story, the text, and the narration, this interplay is very important in the study of narratology. So Evelina, another work by Evelina, another work by James Joyce, also contains an interesting use of this technique that any narratologist like Seymour Chapman will find very interesting. So these works, although they appeared before the publication of Dubliners, especially Evelina, that appeared in Irish Homestead in September 1904 and was later on included in the collection called Dubliners in 1914. Any kind of critical reading of this text must involve narratology as a critical tool for analysis. And we will try to see how the story is turned into a plotted one and how that plot of the story is represented through a narrative. The ideal story that we often find is a story that can be either used in the classroom, especially for pedagogical purposes, or for understanding of critical methods of understanding, analysis of the text. So in this case, today we have taken up narratology as a critical tool. I shall be introducing this term narratology in details. This word narratology, as I stated earlier, denotes both the theory and study of narrative. By narrative, I mean the text, image, and thought. It also involves the narrative structure and how the narrative structure affect the way of our perception of a literary text. So this word narratology goes back, as I stated earlier, to the classical Greek period, especially Plato, 428 to 348 BC, or Aristotle, 384 to 322 BC. So master and disciple. So they drew a distinction between mimesis and diegesis. Mimesis refers to imitation, while diegesis refers to narration. While segregating these two forms, Aristotle also talks about the mimetic imitation called drama and the diegetic imitation or narration called the epic or lyric. For Plato, the term diegetic refers to narratorial discourse. Okay, this term has been used by modern narratologists like Gerard Genett, who uses this word for his analysis of text. And for him, this word is adopted from Soriu. Okay, in Soriu's 18th journal, this word diegese was used. And this word diegese, of course, has certain affinities with Aristotle's notion of mimesis. Okay, like Aristotle, Gerard Genett, while analyzing the narratological structure, gives primacy to the mythos. Aristotle also gave more importance to the plot. He said that the plot is the soul of drama, character is secondary. Similarly, Gerard Genett also says that mythos or the plot is a central abstract structure of narrative. While Plato classified speech representation as pure narrative poetry and pure drama, or even a mixture of the narrative and the dialogic dramatic type. For example, the epic, case of epic, we have the narrator narrating the story, say Homer in Iliad, narrating the story. But inside that narration, we also have instances of drama, say Achilles delivering a speech. You are familiar with Paradise Lost, where we have Satan delivering his speech. So when Satan is delivering a speech, we have the use of the mimetic mode of representation, of narrating the story. When Milton is narrating the story, or the narrator is narrating the story in the third person omniscient narrative voice, we have the diegesis, the interplay of the narrative and the dramatic. Okay, the mimetic and the diegetic is also brought in the purview of narratology. Okay, narratology therefore does not differentiate any kind of mimesis that is based on simple dramatic representation or simple narrative storytelling. It does not make a distinction. It takes into account both the forms. So we have Aristotle's pure narratives and direct representations. And direct representation can be divided into two types. One, telling the story directly. Second, showing the story. Okay. So Bertolt Brecht, while he is talking about un-Aristotelian type of drama, he is also using the narrative structure, the episodic structure, to narrate the story. So it is more like showing you certain significant pages of history, as in Life of Galileo. So Genett's notion of diegese actually refers to the primary story level, specifically excluding the narratorial discourse, which constitutive of both Plato's concept of mimesis and diegesis, as well as Stangel's understanding of diegese. So Genett then goes on to define diegese. What is diegese according to Genett? It is the universe in which the story takes place. Very simple definition. According to Genett, it is the universe in which the story actually takes place. But this story that takes place has to be organized in a space with time. So chronotope should be there, and there should be the presence of the narrator. Okay, the mediacy has to be there, and this mediacy is introducing a kind of distinction between mimesis and diegesis. While in mimesis, the actors are there on the stage performing characters. Okay, although the narrator may introduce the story, but once the drama starts, we only have the actors on the stage representing the story. While in case of the ancient rhapsodies presenting the story, like Ion presenting the story, we have the mediacy of a particular narrator who is telling you the story. So we have this Genett and Stanzel, they both agree with regard to the constitutive narratorial meditation of narrative. It is achieved through the narrative instance. So for Janet, the narrator's speech act produces the story through the narrative discourse. I repeat, according to Janet, the narrator's speech act actually produces the story through the narrative discourse. This dichotomy between mimesis and diegesis has been used by contemporary narratologists to support both the models of speech and thought representation. Although distinction has been drawn between direct and free indirect speech, along with the generic distinction between narrative and drama, in modern narratology, we have the application of this theory of analyzing the text, analyzing the narrative structure, the discourse, the speech act, that is applicable across genres. So almost all the genres, literary genres, can be brought under the purview of narratology, even if it is dramatic text. As a discipline, narratology is a very modern one. It started shaping itself around 1966 in the French journal named Communications. We had a special issue entitled The Structural Analysis of Narrative. Okay, the structural analysis of narrative. So in this particular journal, this special issue, the journal's name is Communications, the special issue entitled The Structural Analysis of Narrative. The term narratology was popularized. But later on, after 2 or 3 years, so one of the contributors of this text, of this special issue, Zvetan Todorov, in 1969 introduced the term narratology in critical discourse. So critical theory has this term narratology introduced by Zvetan Todorov. Narratology is the theory of the structures of narrative, according to Todorov. So narratology, according to Zvetan Todorov, is the theory of the structure of narratives. Therefore, in order to investigate a structure or to present a structural description, a narratologist, like a stylistic historian, dissect the narrative phenomenon into their component parts and then attempts to determine the function and relationship. All theories of narrative distinguish between what is narrated. So what is narrated? What is narrated is actually the story and how it is narrated. So how the story is narrated, that is the discourse. So all the theories of narrative actually try to interrelate as well as distinguish what is narrated, the story, and how it is narrated, the discourse. Some theorists, as I mentioned, like Janet, opt for restricting narratives to verbally narrated text. So we know that text can be verbally narrated and can be visually narrated. So we were reading Bhimayana that combines the visual narrative with the verbal narrative. Janet says that narratology should be applied more to the verbally narrated text. But others like Barth, Chapman, Ball, they all argue that anything that tells a story in whatever genre, including the graphic, can constitute a narrative. So in the Potua art or in the Gond art through which the story is narrated, we can find some kind of narrative or linguistic, visual, verbal system of narration, storytelling can be done. You remember Ferdinand de Saussure? Ferdinand de Saussure, in his famous and seminal work in linguistics, said that a sign consists of a signifier and a signified. What is the meaning of these words? Signifier, basically a form. Signified, basically what it signifies. That means the meaning. For a narrative text, every narrative text is a complex sign. Okay. And in that narrative text, that is a complex sign, the signifier is a discourse. Okay. The signifier, that means the form, is a discourse. That means a mode of representation, mode of presentation. And the signified is actually the story. That means the action sequence, what happens. So how it happens is the discourse, mode of representation. And what happens is the action sequence, the chronological sequence of action. That is the story. So if the story happens, okay, story is there. How the story that has happened in time and space is narrated through the mode of representation through a discourse. So signified is the discourse, whilst the signified is the story. Narratological investigation therefore pursues one of the two basic orientations. So we can classify narratological investigation into two forms. Number one, discourse narratology, and number two, we can say story narratology. What is discourse narratology? Discourse narratology analyzes stylistic choices that actually determine the form or realization of a narrative text or performance, especially in case of drama, in case of films. So I repeat, discourse narratology analyzes the stylistic choices that determine the form of realization of a narrative text or performance, especially in case of cinema or plays. And here we have the interest more focused on the pragmatic features that contextualize text or performance within the social and cultural framework of a narrative act. The second was story narratology. What is this story narratology? The story narratology focuses on the action units. Okay, the action units that actually implot and arrange a stream of events into a trajectory of themes, motives, and plot lines. In contemporary literary theory and criticism, therefore, narratology is concerned with all types of narratives, whether the narratives are literary and non-literary, whether the narratives are fictional or non-fictional, verbal or non-verbal. The project that you are going to complete is actually a narrative that combines literary and non-literary, fictional and non-fictional, verbal and non-verbal, as is Bhimayana. So we have a combination, and narratology can be applied to all types of narratives that we usually find. In modern criticism, or especially in postmodern criticism, especially the post-structuralist discourse, we have in modern academic theorists who take this type of analysis, they are called narratologists. Okay, so it has an antecedent even in the works of the new critics like Cleon Brooks and Robert Penn Warren. In 1943, Robert Penn Warren and Cleon Brooks, they published a book called Understanding Fiction. In this work, Understanding Fiction, these critics dealt with a story like Araby, and they identified many of the ideas that modern narratologists would later on expand. What were their findings? They located the theme of romantic disillusionment, references to religion, differences between the male narrator and the boy protagonist, with an objective to explicate the story. So several writers have worked on this, how the story can be understood with reference to the narratological ways. Even Wayne Booth, when he was reading Araby, James Joyce's Araby that was published in Dubliners, he argues that there is a hard resistant core of fact about Araby that will test what anyone wants to say, because there are different readings of the story depending on how one approaches the story. So these different types of approaches depend on a deconstruction of some essential facts that lie at the core of the story. So he went on to read the text Araby. Wayne Booth went on to read Araby through various techniques. So James Joyce's Quarterly, James Joyce Quarterly, published in 1981, used Dubliners as a text for pedagogic purpose and how the text can be read. Especially who wanted to test a practical application of a story, they started referring to Samuel Chapman's book, The Story and Discourse. So I have suggested Story and Discourse for our close reading of narratology. I will discuss this text later on. So Samuel Chapman's book, Story and Discourse, was taken as a source book for narratological analysis of the works of James Joyce, especially Dubliners. So, analyzing Araby as a story and discourse. This was an article that this project contained, and other articles also. They found that Chapman's ideas can be applied, especially to the reading of text that have different layers of meaning generated by the act of narration. So, in these stories, most of the critics, they identified two main characters. Who are the two main characters in a story like Araby? You remember Araby, James Joyce's Araby. It is a story of a 11-year-old boy, okay, who is living in Dublin in a restricted world, almost always alone, and finding in this grey drabs surrounding a total isolation. Accompanies his aunt to the marketplace and secretly cherishes idea of love. He has fallen in love with a neighborhood girl called Mangan's sister. And there is a fair bazaar named Araby. So, will you go to Araby? The girl asks, and the boy says, yes, I will. And if I go there, he promises, I will bring a gift for you. So, the boy keeps on waiting for permission from his uncle and finally gets an opportunity to visit Araby on the last day of the fair. When the moment comes, when he finally reaches the place, he finds the lights are off and the magical name of Araby displayed goes off, and suddenly he is transported into a world of experience that totally shatters his romantic illusion. And towards the end of the story, we find the same boy who was carrying a chalice containing the ideal of love, imagining himself as the Arthurian knight chasing love through adventures, finally finds himself in a world of loss and could not bring any kind of gift for the girl when he returns. So, this is the story of Araby. So, in this story, they identified two characters. Who are these two characters in the story? Number one, the narrator. James Joyce is already 24, okay, when he is writing Araby. But these stories are based on his childhood experience. Especially Araby is based on his childhood experience when James Joyce was 11. And James Joyce once stated that in his early draft called Stephen Hero, that went on to become a portrait of the artist as a young man. In that work, he is saying that one cannot represent through a story the story of childhood, because past that is remembered by us is always kept in an iron memorial, and once that is kept in an iron memorial, it gradually accumulates multiple layers through change, through aging. Therefore, the childhood experience experienced when he was 11 cannot be narrated by an adult narrator when he is 23 or 24. So, the story told by James Joyce about this boy in Araby is a story recollected from childhood, but represented through the immediacy of an adult narrator. Now, the problem is how to tell the story. James Joyce resolves or dissolves these two identities into one, fuses these two identities into one, the character and the narrator into one, and adopts an innovative technique to tell you the story. The story is that of an 11-year-old boy. The narrator is a person who has grown up. But in that story of a person who has grown up, James Joyce can include that small boy narrator. Therefore, the voices are there, multifaceted, multi-layered, dialogic, okay, polyphonic, unsaturated. Voices are there, and that make the story more interesting. So, we have this application of Seymour Chapman's theory of narratology in the book Story and Discourse applied to James Joyce, and these critics therefore identified the presence of two main characters instead of one in the story. Number one, the narrator, and number two, the boy protagonist. And they went on to list certain traits, first of the narrator and second of the boy protagonist. So, in so many texts where we have the first person narrator, The narrator himself is the protagonist of the text. Okay, narrator come participant whenever the story is told in the first person. When we have a story told in the third person, omniscient narration, we have a distance between the narrator and the character. In case of James Joyce's Araby, we have a dissolution of these two identities, and yet distinction of these two identities of the boy and the narrator. Boy is the character, while James Joyce, the person, is the narrator. So this is a problem even with Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. If you remember Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, it has got a unique structure, a story within a story within a story type structure, where we have the primacy of the writer, the novelist who is writing, Joseph Conrad, and then Joseph Conrad is introducing the primary narrator who is actually framing the entire story. And then we have in the story of Marlowe. Marlowe narrates the story, and within Marlowe's story we have so many stories, especially the story of Codes at the core. And finally, inside the story of Codes, again we have the voice of Codes, the dying words of Codes, the horror. In order to explain this structure, I would be using a graphic representation so that you can understand what type of narratological structure we find. I would be sharing this PowerPoint presentation where we can see the structure. I hope you all can see the structure. So this particular model.
Yes, sir.
All of you can see the structure?
Yes, sir.
So in this structure, the model actually distinguishes between the level of action, fictional mediation, and non-fictional communication, and establishes useful points of reference for key terms like author, reader, narrator, and narrative addressee. So narratology will try to investigate these structures. So see the large rectangle where we have the level of non-fictional communication. Okay, non-fictional communication, because this is a communication between the author and the reader. Why do I call this non-fictional? Because the author is real and the reader is also real. The author is writing the story. Okay, the person who is writing the story, therefore his presence is there or her presence is there. Reader who is reading the story or seeing the film, audience seeing a play, they all belong to the non-fictional world of communication. So that is the major area where we have the plotting of the story, the entire structure. So accordingly, we can say that the generic classification can be distinguished. So when it is a dramatic representation, we have the playwright communicating to the audience. When we have a prose composition, we have a writer communicating with the reader. So this is the broad category of non-fictional communication. Inside that non-fictional communication, once the text is written, to tell you the story, we usually have a narrator. In some cases, the author appears to be the narrator. Sometimes the author disguises herself as a character narrating the story, like in Virginia Woolf or James Joyce. Sometimes we find the author is using a device of omniscience, hiding behind the narrator and allowing this narrator to tell the story from the omniscient point of view. A person who can see everything, who knows everything, who knows the plot, what is going to happen, and starts telling you the story. And when the story is addressed, it is addressed to the listeners, addressee. So readers are also listeners to this story. While in the non-fictional communication, we have reader or the audience in the real space and time reading the story. In case of narrator and addressee, we have a fictional world of mediation. Why do I call this fictional world? Because the addressee here again is the reader and the audience, has to suspend her sense of disbelief for a moment and then believe in what is being narrated. And once that sense of realism, sense of belief in our real world is suspended for a while, willing suspension of disbelief is there for a while, we start understanding the story, we start appreciating the story, listening to the story. So you are in the fictional world. Even in the theater house, when you are seated in the chair, you are actually in a hyper real world. You are not in a real world. You are in a structured world where you have to sit there in the chair. And once the curtain is drawn, what we find? A rectangular box-like structure where the story is placed and narrated. So there, the actors perform the story through characters, and the audience has to perform the role of an audience. And this happens in the fictional, make-believe, artificial world. So whatever is happening on the stage is fictional, and whatever is narrated through the text, in case of novel or short story or even poem, has to be appreciated by suspending the sense of disbelief. Therefore, if Shakespeare is dead, long live Shakespeare, Shakespeare is there in the play. But his absence is now felt because of the characters on the stage. Macbeth is there, through whom we are transported into the imaginative, magnificent world of Julius Caesar, of Macbeth. In case of novel also, we have the absence of the author. Author may have died long ago, and even with this absence of the author, we can say that the narrator is alive. So how can a narrator live? Because the level of fictional mediation is there. And this is a story told by the narrator. Inside that, we have the story. Okay, so narrative discourse is the narrator-addressee relationship that creates the discourse narratology. While inside that, we have characters, interplay of characters, one character talking to other character, and there is a level of action. That means the story is there inside. Say in Pride and Prejudice, the omniscient narrator first gives an ironic statement. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a man in possession of good fortune must be in want of a wife. So that is narrator addressing to the readers, addressee, who transport themselves to the fictional space and time of provincial England towards the end of the 18th century. So we have this transportation of the readers into that fictional world. And through this fictional meditation, the narrator introduces us to the world of the Bennets. Soon we find Bennets organizing themselves, preparing themselves. And when we meet Mrs. Bennet, in that very page, we find she is worried because 5 daughters are unmarried. And we soon find that through this character to character level of action and discourse, exchange and dialogues, we soon find that it is a truth that is materially observed that these 5 girls, along with Mrs. Bennet, they are in search of a suitable husband, because in that world, the only suitable profession, respectable profession that was for the daughters of the house was to plunge themselves into the matrimonial world and get hold of a suitable bride, groom. So this is what we find in the story. So see how the narrator story that was addressed in the initial lines is contradicted by the level of action, the character to character story that is there inside. Similar is the case with a work like Heart of Darkness. So Heart of Darkness, as we know, is based on Conrad's personal experience through Congo. So once upon a time, he went to Congo and had such and such experience. Now, the reliability of the writer has to be resolved. If the writer tells the story directly to the audience, just becoming a narrator, addressing the story to the addressee, there will be some loss of fidelity, some loss of faith in what the story is being told. Therefore, Joseph Conrad was trying to invent a person who is also related to the same navigational world, a person who can tell you the story whose story will be more reliable, who can tell you the story in such a way that the story can be more reliable. Therefore, he introduces primary author, primary narrator. So author takes the disguise of primary narrator first and tries to introduce the narrator-addressee relationship by locating the text in the context. So there is a large barge, Nelly, anchored in the river Thames, and where we have the description of the locale, the sun is setting down, and on this Nelly, we have the act of storytelling. So this primary narrator will simply start his narration that this space too was one of the darkest region of the world. Romans came thousands of years ago, and this place was also a colonial dark world. And then this narrator moves on to focus on the primary narrator. Primary narrator, or the narrator who is there inside the story, not the frame narrator. The frame narrator frames the story, creates a kind of spatio-temporal dimension, and allows the discourse to take place. So this narrator, the frame narrator, creates the relationship between narrator and addressee and works on the fictional world of meditation. Soon the readers, we are transported to that world of fiction, where there is really a Nelly, a yacht waiting for the sail. The location is there, and then this frame narrator focuses attention on the insert narrator, and this insert narrator is also a character. Soon we find the character to character level of action, the interaction between characters, and this interaction between characters actually frame the story. This frame narrator then describes Marlowe by focalizing on Marlowe, and this focalization on Marlowe with reference to the stance that Marlowe has taken, the stance of Buddha sitting on a lotus flower and giving his sermon after realization of truth, that type of stance. And then he goes on to describe what type of story is to be told. So this frame narrator, who is also the narrator addressing to the audience, tries to create the spatio-temporal dimension for the story to take place, the action involving characters to take place. This narrator is also a participant, because this narrator, the frame narrator, is also listening to the story of Marlowe. So Marlowe is there seated, and he is described as a person sitting in the posture of Buddha, preaching or sermonizing about his experience and trying to derive the truth. So this primary narrator then goes on to tell about Marlowe and differentiates Marlowe's stories from other storytellers. The tales of the ordinary, the yarns of the ordinary seaman has a simplicity, because the entire story is contained within the nut, like the kernel. Marlowe's stories are different, because the stories are not contained within, but like the faint halo that is surrounding, the semi-transparent luminous halo that is surrounding the moon. The meaning of Marlowe's stories lie outside the nut, and whenever the light falls on the story, there is a faint illumination, and in that illumination we have the meaning of the story. So now Marlowe starts. He has already got the basis of telling a story, and he has been introduced as a storyteller who will be giving you hints without telling you the story. Being a participant in the story, this narrator, Marlowe, will also involve himself in the first person speech act, narrating his own story. So Marlowe tells his story and begins with that philosophical statement again. So the wildest and the scramblest loot that ever disfigured the conscience of mankind. So African experience. So he wants to enter into the darkness of Africa in order to understand the truth lying luckily hidden. So hidden, luckily. So while telling the story, Marlowe is using different levels of action in order to reach the story. So he talks about his childhood fascination with the map that are painted, colored, maps that are not colored, maps that are not yet mapped. So he finds a snake gradually uncoiling itself into the heart of Africa. Africa is heart-shaped, and there he finds the Congo River uncoiling like a snake. And he, in his personal desire, wants to reach the tail of the snake. So it is his childhood wish that he says. And looking at the map, he visualizes his experience. Of course, this action that the narrator introduces, Marlowe, the narrator introduces, is a kind of psychological journey into the innermost recesses of the human mind, a kind of Freudian journey into the darkest horror of the mind, trying to encounter the tail of the snake, journey into the innermost recesses, the dark recesses of the human mind. But this psychological journey is also supported by a kind of physical journey on the level of action, a physical journey into the real geographical world of Africa, where this Marlowe, a European, has to go inside Africa in order to bring back a person named Kurz, who is also a European, who has gone to Africa and has become a very successful ivory trader. And everyone in Europe wants to know the secret of his success, how he has succeeded in supplying so much ivory and turning this ivory trade into a rich mine of resources. So Marlowe's task is to fetch an ailing Kurz from the inner station by traveling upstream the Congo, and while journeying upstream the Congo, he finally reaches the innermost core of the heart of darkness, lying at the core of a European mind. So while telling the story, he talks about the doctor, the physician. So in the level of action, we have this narrator also mediating his narration with references, allusions to so many images. So when he goes for an appointment, he finds women dressed in dark, knitting wool, reminded of the three sisters of classical period, who actually weave life, continue life, and cut life. The images that we find in Riders to the Sea through Kathleen and Nora. So he is reminded of that. And then there is the doctor who appears. And doctor then measures the skull of Marlowe. So external measurement of skull is required according to the doctor, because on the level of action, the doctor is trying to see why this man is planning to go to Africa, and whether this man will have some kind of psychological change that happens within the mind, within the brain. Therefore, he is measuring the circumference of the skull of this man, who is by his own desire going to Africa. Gulliver also went to Africa. Gulliver also went to the unknown land, Lilliputian, Brobdingnagian, Yahuian. So he went. We also have Robinson Crusoe, stranded alone. So what is the transformation that is taking place in the mind of a European colonist? So that is the character to character level of action. When Marlowe reaches Africa, we have again different layers of this analysis. He meets the accountant, you remember, a person in white, dressed white, with starched dress, in the most depressing, hot and humid climate of Africa. Why has this accountant put on this dress? Just to impress a native African. So such stories are there inset on the level of action, where we have the characters actually telling the story. What about Kurz? What about Kurz? Everyone is anxious to know. Marlowe himself enters into this act of knowing the story of Kurz. Someone say, yes, he is very good. Someone say he is very bad. Someone say that he is a great orator, a great politician, a great person. Someone say he has turned into a savage. Someone say he's a very successful businessman. So we have so many alternative types of references to Kurz. And through these stories, multiple stories, we have character to character level of action and the build up of story. So how the narration takes place. So we are going to study that act, how the author has composed a novel, a text, a story for the readers, how in the story we have, in the novel, we have the narrator addressing the audience and telling you the story, and how this narrator has created characters inside the story in the level of action in the fictional world within the space and time, becoming real life characters, and through the interaction how they are revealing the story. So these different levels of text can easily be found. Narratology, therefore, so I am using this. So I have not yet added a title to this. So this person is telling a story, the large bubble. Okay, speech bubble is telling the story. In Heart of Darkness, we have this primary narrator. Inside this, there is a smaller bubble, insert story of Marlowe. So we can structure the entire narrative as you can see this. There can be multiplicity also. Multiple characters can also be there. There can be difference between the narrator and actor, narrator as participant. There can be shortcomings of the narrator, as in, say, Edward Fitzgerald's, Scott Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby. So we have Nick Carraway as the narrator, who at the beginning of the story tells, in my childhood, my father said that whenever you are going to criticize someone, always remember that everyone did not have the privilege and opportunities that you have. So Nick Carraway simply confesses to the readers, so this is my limitation. So I will not make any comment on Gatsby. The central story of the text is actually the story of Gatsby. So what does Nick Carraway do? He takes his narrative pen and starts collecting the stories about Gatsby. One person says Gatsby is a great person, someone says a villain, someone says he is a cheat, someone says that he is an opportunist, someone says that he is a great lover, idealistic lover, someone says he is a betrayer. So all these stories conflict. So action story that is there in the text, that is done between among the players, deviate from the story that is to be told by Nick Carraway. Nick Carraway's therefore story is open-ended. So early narratological studies often involved this type of analysis of the text that identify different aspects of narrative. Among such aspects, we also have point of view. Okay, very important, point of view. So how the narrative expression is communicated, how the narrative uses style to tell the story, and how the point of view is presented. So describing the text as well as interpreting the text, both can be included together in the act of narratology. When we talk about the illustration of a story that makes a short story a perfect one, we can see the performance that is taking place. The performativity is there in the act of narratology, where the narrator is actually performing through representation a story. So it identifies the presence of narrators. So there can be narrators, both introspective, first-person narrators, as well as retrospective narrators. So in Dublin, we have different types of stories. For example, Araby is a story told by first-person I, who provides little in the way of overt commentary and explicit judgment. So we have a kind of design that is there in Dubliners. That design is also seen in Evelyn, where we have the presence of an indecisive character capable of making a positive decision, and this incapable character, indecisive character, is condemned forever in the vestibule of hell, as in Dante. And therefore the narrator who tells the story, no, 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 recurs in the story. So we have the comparable position of immortal Francesca in Dante's great love story, Inferno, present in these stories of James Joyce. Say the prospective statement that we find in Araby of Mangan's sister. What does she say? Inside the story, there is the story of the Mangan sister, whose words, "It's well for you to visit Araby." That lies at the core. And being inspired by these words, "It is well for you," this boy takes this arduous journey, okay, begging for money to visit Araby. So this word, these words of Mangan's sister, "It is well for you," recurs, reverberates again and again. So is, however, negated by the words of denial uttered by a woman in the bazaar. So when the boy finally reaches the bazaar, there is again the voice. He's standing in front of a shop and admiring the vase. Arabian vases are there. He's admiring the beauty of the vase. So a woman comes, a saleswoman comes, and she says, what she says? "Ah, go, fib, go. I never said such a thing." So he overhears this. "Oh, I never said such a thing." That voice again. So this voice contradicts the voice of the girl. What did the girl say to the boy? The girl said, "It is well for you to visit Araby." And what is this voice of the woman telling in this ideal world of bazaar? Is that, "Oh, I never said such a thing." Don't we find a contradiction in two stories? So which story is the real one? So this perpetual dilemma of the boy narrator, vacillating between two extremities of the vision of Araby. Araby as a magnificent place, magical place of romance, and Araby as a material space of business. Both these are contradicting. And these contradictions are there in this text, kept alive through the act of narration. So everyone in Dublin seems to be caught up in an endless web of despair. And even when they want to escape it, they find themselves in the same limbo. So Satan has just fallen and stuck in the limbo. Like that, the characters are stuck in the limbo. They want to escape, but they are in the quagmire. You remember, like Pandu's mother, caught in the quagmire, and they are unable. Similar is the case with Evelina. There, where we have the characters unable to accomplish what they want to, especially escape. The artifice of a short story therefore facilitates the analysis of the fragmented, dehumanized self through the fictional narrative and the interplay of different voices that are conflicting, speech acts that are conflicting and contradicting. Therefore, Bakhtin says that dialogic discourse is multifaceted, with centripetal forces at work, polyphonic, with multiple voices coexisting, unsaturated. Narrative strategies become apparent. So narratives can be mediated by narrators who tell and comment on the story, or through agents who merely think, feel, or perceive. Stanzel, narratologist, discriminates between teller characters and reflector characters. So there are two types of characters in the action to action, character to character, center, core of the story. He says there are two types of characters. One can be called teller characters, that we say character participant. The other is reflector characters, again character participant, but who are more reflective. And Stanzel argues that they are meditators of fictional events. So all the storytellers in fiction are actually meditators of fictional events. They mediate story material. What is story material? The sequence of event. Okay. Characters are there, time is there, space is there. So the event sequence, that is the story material. The teller characters usually narrate, inform, and comment as if they were transmitting a piece of news to the readers, audience, or a message, while the reflector characters do not narrate or transmit. Rather, they reflect. Rather, the readers, through the reflection, perceive the action through the eyes of the reflector characters. That is the meditation. So in cinema also we often find that the lens of the camera actually focalizes on the objects that the detective sees, say Feluda, okay, or Bomkesh Bokshi. Whatever things that these detectives see through their eyes, the focalization is done. So readers perceive, that means what the person is thinking, that is actually being narrated to the audience through these reflector characters, through focalization. So rather the reader perceives the action through the eyes of the reflector character, and this veiled medicacy actually produces the illusion of immediacy. Think of Araby. So Araby is standing, Araby, the boy is standing there. There is the street. What type of street is this? A blind street. North Richmond Street being blind. The boy is standing there, and now he is gazing at the houses, the row of houses, and says that these houses gaze at each other with brown, imperturbable faces. Okay, so these houses that have a kind of gray, brownish color, these houses are actually gazing at each other with brown, imperturbable faces. Faces of indifference. There is no response, there is no emotion. So emotionless staring at each other. And this entire street is vacant. No one is there. So we have this representation. So who is seeing the things? The houses as gazing at each other. The blind alley. Okay, the last house where the priest lives. Through the eyes of this boy narrator, we are seeing the story. So either the characters narrate, inform, and comment as if they are transmitting a piece of news, or rather, in the other way, there is a veiled immediacy by this reflector character who creates an illusion of immediacy. So this narrating instance is the communicative act that initiates both the story and the narrative discourse that produces the story. More specifically, if I just talk about this narrative instance, what is this narrative instance? Narrative instance represents events and existence materials, that means the story, and they are all mediated in a particular verbal, visual, or audiovisual system of sign, and together this sign system that we find in fiction is called narrative. So we have a kind of transmission from the addresser to the addressee, from the character to the character, from the author to the reader, and this narrative transmission is the source of authority for the story. According to Chapman, Seymour Chapman, the process of narrative transmission centrally concerns the relationship between story time and discourse time, as well as the issues of voice and point of view. I repeat, Seymour Chapman, in his analysis of the process of transmission, has stated that the source of authority for the story, okay, is the narrative transmission. According to Chapman, the process of narrative transmission centrally concerns the relationship between story time and discourse time, as well as the issues of voice and point of view. So Chapman discriminates between overt narration. Now I come to this word, overt narrators, direct narrators who tell you the story, give you the message. So Chapman discriminates between overt narrator who communicate directly to the readers, and the second type is the covert narrators who remain more or less hidden in the narrative discursive shadows. So they are there in the story, but they remain hidden in the narrative's discursive shadows. So these narratives are built on the mediating function of consciousness. This is, of course, a complex natural category with several cognitive frames to choose from. So we have a kind of mediacy, okay, related to this general cognitive model of narrative transmission based on a kind of real life schemata. The teller mode narratives are mediated by the consciousness of the narrator. The narrator is always conscious. The narrator knows that he is telling the story. Even a character like Marlowe, who is the teller of the story, is also conscious, but he is oblivious of the presence of the audience. He is oblivious of the presence of the audience because he takes the stance of Buddha, mediating and meditating on the story. So teller mode narratives are mediated by the consciousness of a narrator. While on the other hand, what Marlowe is a reflector narrator. So this reflector mode narrative is controlled by the consciousness of a protagonist. So Marlowe, the narrator, is also the protagonist, and therefore he is to tell the story. And the problem with Marlowe is how to tell the story, because the story contains an inner truth, and the inner truth is a bitter truth, and the bitter truth cannot be narrated. Then how can the story be told? So the film narrator has already told that ordinary yarns of the seamen, yarns of the ordinary seamen, contain the story within, like the kernel in a nut. While the stories of Marlowe are different, when the light falls on the nut, there is a faint illumination, like the illumination halo around the moon. And in that faint illumination, one can realize the meaning of Marlowe's story. So this reflector mode narrator, we have a kind of consciousness of the protagonist interwoven with the act of mediacy. There can be also neutral type of narrators, so very objective narrators, so who simply views and construct narrative experience. So almost documentary type of narration. So that neutral narrator does not undergo any kind of change. That narrator can be present in the story, but yet may not participate in the story. Can be a newspaper reporter like narrator, who will simply report the story without getting involved in the story. There, this mediacy is a different one, different type. Now I come to my general conclusion. So we can see that narratology as a technique, a critical theory, can be applied to the study of stories, especially the stories of James Joyce. And Samuel Chapman has definitely used this in his famous analysis of the works of James Joyce, focusing on Arabian Evelina. The art of reading Joyce's short story depends on imaginative and dramatic reconstruction of the missing links in the narrative that run through all the sections of the narrative structure, narrative setup, even the conflict and the resolution. So this active role of the reader is there in order to construct the narrative based on the cues, the hints, narrative hints that are provided in the text. So through this critical reading, using narratology as a critical tool, we can positively come to an understanding of the text. With these words, I hope I have done a little justice to this critical field of study called narratology. So if you have any questions, you can ask. I'll stop sharing the screen, and I shall be stopping the recording too, so that you can be free to ask questions or observation. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.